Philip II by William Thomas Walsh. Chapter 15. Catherine de Medici, 1560. France was not so fortunate. It was too bad, said Philip on more than one occasion, that the French had no Inquisition. They were defenceless against the sort of subversive societies that bored into state councils, courts of law, parliaments, nobility and clergy. Never, perhaps, was he more pleased with the achievements of the Holy Office in Spain than in March 1560, when, about the time of his illness from too much jousting, there came reports of the great conspiracy that had been discovered north of the Pyrenees. It must have been a depressing moment, however, when he learned from l'Aubespine, Bishop of Limoges, Ambassador of France, that, although the spearhead of the attack was aimed at the heart of France, the ultimate purpose was the destruction of the Christian order of Europe, and that the whole intrigue had been traced back to Cecil's government in England. This, according to Tiepolo, who had the story from l'Aubespine, was probably the true reason for King Philip's displeasure with the English ambassadors. Queen Elizabeth, shortly after her accession, had sent emissaries to the kings of Denmark and Sweden, the princes of Germany and the rulers of Switzerland, and all states alienated from the Catholic Church, proposing a league not only for the defence of their religion, but for its propagation, and not so much for the security of her own affairs as to cause trouble and detriment to the crown of France. To dispose men's minds to this effect, she sent 4 English preachers, 4 Germans, and 1 Frenchman from England to Germany, who, feigning to be moved by religious zeal and ardour, went to visit many cities and princes, sometimes themselves preaching what they thought might most facilitate their object, and sometimes making the local preachers perform the like office. Meanwhile, a Scot and a Frenchman went from Scotland to England, and thence to Paris, whither, at their bidding, hastened 40 ministers from Geneva. They assembled with other propagandists maintained by the Calvinist congregation of Geneva, at a place outside Paris, whence they flocked to various assigned districts of France, of which they called themselves the bishops. While an intensive campaign of vituperation was being carried on against the Catholic Church, Duke Francis of Guise, his brother, the Cardinal of Lorraine, and the Queen Mother, Catherine de Medici, arms were to be raised and troops levied. Then a march was to be made on the court of young Francis II on the 16th day of March, 1560. Duke Francis and the Cardinal, as leaders of the Catholic party and chief advisers of the king, were to be killed outright. Calvin had said it was lawful to slay those who hindered the preaching of the gospel. The king was to be slain if he refused to accept the conditions proposed to him. His mother was to be expelled. His 3 younger brothers and sister were to be placed under preceptors who would make sure that they became Protestants. 2 preachers would then carry the gospel of Calvinism to every city of the land. Funds to pay for all this were to be raised by the pillaging of certain designated rich churches by the cohorts of reform on their way to the court. The Cardinal of Lorraine told Michael, Venetian ambassador in France, that the plot originated at Geneva in 1559, a month after the death of Henry II, and that Queen Elizabeth was implicated. This statement finds some support in a letter of Throckmorton, ambassador of Cecil's government at the French court, on July 13, 1559, the very day after the death of Henry II, advising Queen Elizabeth that the moment was favourable for all those who wished to get revenge on France, and a good time for England to think of regaining Calais. On all this struggle against the Catholic order of Europe, the marital affairs of Philip II had had a curious bearing. His second marriage in England had led him to the decision that placed Elizabeth and Cecil in power. But his determination to make peace with France and to cement the new understanding by marriage to the daughter of the French king was a serious threat to the new government of England. It was in celebration of the peace of Cateau-Cambrésis and of the engagement of his daughter to Philip that Henry II, jousting, got the wound which caused his death. France was left in the weak and inexperienced hands of young Francis II and his wife, Mary Stuart. Between them and the international pack who sought to destroy or control them stood the Catholic party of the Guises, led by the Cardinal of Lorraine, a great and loyal statesman, if somewhat too ambitious and covetous, who loved France and the Church, and by his brother Duke Francis, who, having beaten Alba at Metz and having completed the work of St. Joan by recovering Calais, was the idol of the people, especially in Paris. When the French court went to Blois after the departure of the Princess Isabel for Spain just before Christmas 1559, the secret intrigue was spreading all over Europe. Of its magnitude and malign intent there could be no doubt. In France, its moving spirit was Louis de Bourbon, Prince of Conde, who entrusted the execution of the treasonable business to a country gentleman of Perigord, Barry, Lord of La Renaudie, a man as rash and as lacking in judgment as himself. So much is generally admitted. There is less agreement on the details, as revealed later by the confessions of various prisoners, though it must be admitted that some of the most improbable objectives of the plotters were actually realized later. Many of the officers of Antony, King of Navarre, were found actively engaged. Gaspard de Hue was accused of having gone as his emissary to the Geneva Protestants. La Renaudie went to Switzerland to see Calvin, who evidently was fully informed. According to the confession of Captain Massiere, one of the officers of Navarre, the Spanish Protestants in Switzerland were occupied with a design against Philip II. Part of their plot envisaged an uprising of the Moriscos to terrorize the Christian population in Spain. Francis Hotman, a lawyer, carried the plan of the conspiracy from his father-in-law Prevost, Lord of Saint-Germain, to Sturm and other Protestant refugees at Strasbourg. Afterwards, he and Sturm denounced each other. The chiefs of the various factions in the plot held a meeting on February 5, 1560. 3 weeks later, Calvin was informed by Sturm, Hotman, and others that 40,000 men were under arms ready to march. This is doubtless an exaggeration. Nevertheless, unsuspecting young Mary Stuart and her husband were hedged about by a very real peril. It was as Calvin feared, however. There were leaks here and there. A nobleman named Pierre Avenel sent to the king word of mysterious meetings in the house of a Calvinist neighbour. As a known enemy of the man he denounced, he was not believed. Margaret of Parma, regent of the Low Countries, discovered some of the ramifications of the conspiracy there and informed Granvelle, who notified King Francis. On February 12th, the Cardinal of Lorraine first learned of what was going on. Duke Francis of Guise then acted promptly. As Blois was too difficult to defend with the few troops available, he attempted to foil the enemy by taking the king and queen from forest to forest, from chateau to chateau, until they arrived on February 22nd at the well-fortified castle of Amboise on the Loire. There Catherine de Medici summoned Admiral Coligny, he was Conde's cousin and well known to be a Huguenot, on the pretext that she feared an attack by the English fleet. 2 days after the royal family arrived at Amboise, Throckmorton put in an appearance. He had been at Metz and other places on the eastern frontier, and the Guises believed he had been looking for a good place to attack France through Germany. The Cardinal of Lorraine at once escorted Cecil's ambassador to the king and the Queen Mother. In the presence of Coligny, his brother, Cardinal Chatillon, Mary Stuart, and others, Lorraine accused him of being a party to the intrigue. Throckmorton denied the charge. He was almost as skillful as Cecil in covering up traces. Arrests were made and confessions obtained, some by torture. As Guizot admits, and he is no friend of the Lorraine princes, the proofs obtained against Conde were conclusive. Parties of French gentlemen began making sallies from Amboise to look for the advancing Protestants. La Renaudie, riding frantically about to rally his forces, was apparently on the way to make a desperate raid on Amboise when he was intercepted by some of the Guise party, defeated and killed in the fight. His body was taken to Amboise to be hanged on a gallows. There were numerous other arrests, followed by confessions and executions. Calvin denied any complicity in the plot, which he said was stupidly conceived and badly executed. Duke Francis of Guise was again hailed as the saviour of his king and of France and of the Church. The power of the Lorraine princes seemed secure. The Huguenot cause appeared to have suffered a mortal blow. Yet the tumult of Amboise, as it was to be known in history, was the real beginning of the long, bloody series of Huguenot wars, from whose consequences France has never recovered, even to this day. The first blow at the supremacy of the Guises was the appointment as Chancellor of Michel de Hospital. He had won the confidence of the Queen Mother and the Cardinal of Lorraine. He professed to be a Catholic, yet one of his first acts, April 1560, was to obtain through Catherine the Edict of Romorantin, which was the opening wedge for toleration of the new doctrines and which prevented the introduction of the Inquisition, a project of the Guises. Conde was arrested when he attended the meeting of the States General at Orléans and condemned to death. L'Hôpital saved his life by refusing to sign the warrant. The second and more serious misfortune of the Guises was the death of King Francis II on December 5, 1560. The news reached the court of Spain just before Christmas and caused not only grief but deep concern over what would happen in France. Mary Stuart overnight had become of no importance there. All the power that her uncles, the Guises, had held now slipped into the hands of the Queen Mother. The new king, Charles IX, was only 12. Who could say what Catherine de' Medici would do? How much, after all, did this Italian woman, this descendant of Florentine moneylenders, care about France? Her own flesh and blood she loved, even though it had been badly tainted by the vices of the dying strain of the Valois. She had feared that the smallpox of her daughter Isabel de la Paz was something worse, and the brain of young Francis II was found to be almost wholly decomposed. Still they were hers, and she loved them. For years in the court of Francis I, she had been snubbed and neglected because she was thought to be barren. Then she had borne 10 children in rapid succession. Besides Charles IX and the Queen of Spain, there now survived Henry, Duke of Anjou, Hercules, who taking his dead brother's name became Francois of Alençon, and Marguerite of Valois, all rather pitiful specimens of royalty. Under the placid and patient exterior of Catherine, an unsuspected ambition now revealed itself. If it arose partly from the need of self-assertion in a personality long suppressed, partly from mother love, it received strong nourishment from 2 outside sources. One was Il Principe, which Machiavelli had dedicated to her father, Duke Cosimo, and whose pagan maxims were Catherine's political Bible. For, although her heart was Catholic, her mind was not. The other was the almost incredible influence that the Jewish astrologer and quack Nostradamus had over her will. She firmly believed in his prediction, made a few years previously, that all her children would sit upon thrones. Catherine now found herself confronting 3 important parties. She might have made sure of peace and unity in France and of a limited support from Philip II, now that Mary Stuart was no longer Queen of France, against England, if she had been willing to efface herself and leave young Charles in the loyal and masterful hands of the Catholic Guises, descendants of Charlemagne and of St. Louis. But Catherine wanted power for herself. She was doubtless afraid that in time she would lose all control of the House of Lorraine. As a Catholic, she shrank from giving place to the Huguenots, the leaders of whom, moreover, were quite as domineering as the Guises, and far more unscrupulous. Numerically, they were never even a large minority in France. As late as 1569, indeed, they comprised only 1/30th of the common people. Their strength was among the nobility, especially those old families of the southern provinces where the Cathari had anticipated many doctrines of Luther and Calvin as early as the 12th century. No form of Protestantism ever made much headway as a religion in France. Calvinism did so rather as a political movement. It is worth noticing that, like English Protestantism, it was neither indigenous nor democratic, but crept in surreptitiously as an international force and worked its way down through families of wealth, usually connected by ties of marriage and interest. It may be said to have found a doorway into France through the unprincipled mind of that immoral woman, Louise of Savoy. Her flippant son became King Francis I, whose policies and wars weakened the authority of the Church and whose protection of some of the first heretical preachers gave a foothold first to Lutheranism, then to Calvinism, though he had also had Lutherans burned. Her daughter, Marguerite of Angoulême, became Queen of Navarre and protectress of the principal seed plot of heresy in France, sharing with her friend the Dame de Soubise her cousin Renée of France, Duchess of Ferrara, and Gabrielle d'Etampes, mistress of her royal brother, the honour of mothering the Reformation there. It was from Marguerite's corrupt court that Anne Boleyn returned to England with Protestant views and pagan morals. It was under her protection that Lefebvre defended Reuchlin and taught Farel and Roussel. It was her daughter, Jeanne d'Albret, who became the heretical wife of foolish King Anthony of Navarre and mother of Henry of Berne, later Henry IV, and the Prince of Conde, stuttering, brave, deformed yet debonair, was Antony's nephew. It was in her court, finally, and by her example and influence, that Louise de Montmorency grew up so staunch a Calvinist. She was related to the Constable Anne de Montmorency, who flirted with political Protestantism but remained a Catholic, and to Montagny and his brother Hoorns, leader of the revolt against Philip II in the Netherlands. Her real influence upon French history came through her marriage to General Gaspard Coligny the Elder and the secret instruction in heresy she gave her children. Of her 4 sons, Odette, the eldest, had been made a cardinal in early youth by the Medici Pope Clement VII at the instance of Francis I. Though never a priest, he voted in 2 papal conclaves and was an excellent example of that corruption in the Church which he inveighed against so piously after he was expelled from it. Living with great luxury and ostentation in Paris, patron of Rabelais and Ronsard, paramour of Isabelle de Hauteville, and cause of much murmuring among the poor against the Church, whose most sacred teachings he privately mocked. It had been known since the scandal of 1558 that he was a Huguenot. He hesitated to leave the Church, even after Pope Paul IV appointed him one of the 3 inquisitors for France, some thought to force him to declare himself. When he had communion given in the Protestant fashion at his church in Beauvais in 1561, the common people were so incensed that they rose up and drove him from his diocese. Excommunicated by Pope Paul IV in 1563, he sought a reconciliation but lapsed again. In 1564, he married his mistress and became openly a part of the international left wing. His brother, d'Andelot, a good soldier, was lacking in powers of leadership. Another brother, Gaspard, better known as Admiral Coligny, was the most impressive member of the family, with a regal presence, a persuasive personality, and a genius for intrigue and organisation, second only, perhaps, to that of Cecil. His character, like those of other leaders in that titanic war for the mastery of the world, has been hotly disputed. But even in Spain, whose enemy he was, his virtues were admitted. Cabrera, for example, calls him the mover of the machine, quick in tongue and hand, of vast genius, terrible courage, sagacity, fortitude and boldness, faith and constancy for those of his own sort, but without religion, fear or knowledge of God, neither pious, just, nor honest, venerating only his ambition, covering his vices with crafty dissimulation and pretense of modesty, until he felt strong enough to throw off the mask. He openly became a Protestant in 1559 after his release following the Battle of St. Quentin. Catherine de' Medici liked but feared him. He was obviously the guiding intelligence of that half-revealed conspiracy that was applying to France the technique of the great anti-Christian intrigues of the Middle Ages, the technique of most of the modern anti-Catholic movements, including Freemasonry and communism. Some light is shed upon the methods of the Châtillons and the links that existed between them and other key men of the international conspiracy by a letter to the English Privy Council in February 1561 from Sir Nicholas Throckmorton and Francis Russell, Earl of Bedford, who were then at Ferrara on some sort of mission to Renée of France, the heretical duchess. They quoted her as follows: "To be plain, quod she, with you, the chiefest promoter of that matter in this court," the French, "is the admiral, and his brother, the Cardinal of Châtillon. For, if it were not for them, no good would be done, and one travaileth with the Queen Mother, the other with the King of Navarre." She added that the Cardinal had been in hand with the Queen Mother. To remove the schoolmaster of the boy king, apparently too good a Catholic for her taste, for she described him as but a very beast, and ill-affected to religion. The efforts of the Huguenot cardinal were not wholly wasted. 2 years later, the Prince of Conde could boast of the Protestant tendencies of Charles to Cecil's ambassador, Sir Thomas Smith, saying, "Why should not your sovereign marry the most Christian king? He is more inclined to the gospel than is commonly supposed, and the union of the two crowns would be a crushing blow to popery." Between this wily proselytizing spirit and the lordly assurance of the Guises, Catherine de' Medici turned to a third party, made up apparently of Catholics who professed to be neutral and in favour of toleration for all. They were political Catholics, men of compromise who abhorred controversy and bloodshed, men of property and respectability. In France they were called les politiques, in Spain los políticos. Cabrera doubtless expresses the prevalent Spanish view when he says bluntly that they were worse than the heretics, for they would follow either heretics or Catholics according to what they got. To Catherine de' Medici they seemed to hold forth the only hope of escape from violence on the right and violence on the left. The simplicity of their programme was appealing. They proposed, in effect, to make Calvinist and Catholic lie down side by side by the direct expedient of granting the Calvinist what he asked for, freedom of worship, on the theory that what he asked for was all that he really wanted. The leader of this liberal Catholic party was Michel de L'Hopital. His office gave him unique powers. The Chancellor of France exercised both legislative and executive functions, and was also the chief judge of the nation and keeper of the seals. Michel de L'Hopital was one of those clever self-made men of obscure origin who played so striking a part in the history of the 16th century. His father had been a physician, money changer, and general factotum for Charles of Bourbon. Young Michel, like Thomas Cromwell, had travelled about Europe considerably before he settled down in Paris, and was recommended for the chancellorship by the then incumbent Olivier just before his death. Meimberg and other Jesuits asserted that he was of Jewish descent. The Bishop of Metz, Beaucaire, said that his grandfather was a Jew of Avignon, and that Michel himself was a man somewhat learned but of no religion, or, to truly speak, an atheist, and accused the Chancellor's father of having betrayed France to Charles V. Francois Duchesne also gives him the Jew of Avignon for a grandfather. This has been vigorously denied by Monsieur de la Fay de l'Hôpital, a descendant of the Chancellor, and by such Huguenot champions as C.T. Atkinson. Jewish historians are not so sceptical on the subject. The finely intelligent and urbane pen of Mr. Joseph Jacobs, tracing the movement for toleration that led to the Edict of Nantes, in part to both Jewish example and indirect influence, adds this: "It cannot be by chance that the three most prominent voices among the politique who laid down the principles which were to result in the edict, Michel de l'Hôpital, Jean Bodin, and Michel de Montaigne, were all partly of Jewish race." L'Hôpital had a family mixed in religion. Although he attended Mass every day and received the sacraments, his wife, Marie Morin, was a Protestant, and his daughter and son-in-law were Protestants. He convinced the Queen Mother, and it is not impossible that he convinced himself, that he had no object but the true welfare of the Catholic Church in a peaceful France. But it cannot be denied that his influence led to the very violence Catherine sought to avoid, and delivered her into the hands of Coligny and the Calvinists. It seemed not a little strange in Spain and at Rome that his love for the Church should be so often expressed in terms almost identical with those employed by men who frankly sought her destruction. Both L'Hôpital and Coligny, for example, urged upon the Queen Mother the assembly of notables at Fontainebleau. When the meeting was held, L'Hôpital supported the suggestion that a national council be held for the reform of the Church, a proposal certain to end in a Gallican Church, as separate from Rome, perhaps, as was the Church of England. The Guises and the other right-wing Catholics valiantly resisted. The politique, however, had a majority in the assembly, forming a sort of popular front with the Huguenots. They carried a vote to convoke the States General at Meaux in December 1560 and the National Council on January 20th, 1561. L'Hôpital opened the States General by a vigorous attack on the church and the clergy. But the Guises were determined at all costs to prevent the tragedy of a national council. In this they had the support not only of Pope Pius IV, but of Philip II, both of whom were energetically striving for a second council of all Christendom at Trent. Philip sent Don Antonio de Toledo, Grand Prior of Leon, to beg Catherine not to consent to the folly of a Gallican council. But the envoy received a cold reception and a refusal from the Queen Mother and young Charles IX. On his way home he was robbed in Gascony. He returned to Castile mal satisfacto. When Philip sent a second embassy to the French court with the pésame for the death of Francis II, he took the opportunity to advise Catherine to keep the royal authority in her own hands and to commit the government only to good Catholics faithful to their king. It must have been about that time, perhaps a little earlier, that he counselled her to ensure the peace and unity of her country by cutting off the heads of the chief Huguenots. This advice, which, as Philip reminded her later, would have saved the falling of a great many other heads, was of course not followed. But the plan for a national council met so much opposition among Catholics that it was postponed. L'Hôpital, Coligny, and Cardinal Chatillon now persuaded the Queen Mother to invite the leading Calvinist preachers to come from Geneva for a public dispute with important Catholics, in the hope of reaching some satisfactory compromise. The great exhorter, Theodore Beza, who could as easily usurp another man's wife as another man's parish, and was ever more in love than in charity, as they that knew him well say, appeared openly in France under a safe conduct, with another sent him by the Queen of England. The apostate monk Peter Martyr went to Poissy with Catherine's permission. Suriano reported the progress of the affair to the Doge and Senate of Venice on September 8, 1561. The papal nuncio, Cardinal d'Este of Ferrara and Cardinal d'Armagnac, would attend the dispute, and if Beza spoke of the reform of life and the correction of abuses in the Church, they would not only listen, but would accept any useful proposal that may be made. However, if they spoke of any dogmas or other matters, the essence of our faith, they would not listen or reply, unless in writing, for to a Catholic the Christian revelation itself was not debatable. If it be true what the Queen told me, that there will be no disputation about dogmas, added the shrewd ambassador, everything will go off quietly. But I do not believe Her Majesty understands what is meant by this word dogmas. I fear indeed that, like others here who daily insist on disputing about religion, she confounds dogmas with rights and abuses, as if they were all one and the same thing. The Queen further assured me, first, that no change would be made in religion, secondly, that the obedience to His Holiness would not be altered in any way, and thirdly, that no attempt would be made to alienate church property. The colloquy of Poissy was opened at the appointed time, therefore, by L'Hôpital. Beza set forth the Calvinist position. The Cardinal of Lorraine replied to him. The Queen, wrote Suriano, was greatly contented with the answer, for the Cardinal had made it clear, 1. That the King was only a member of the Church and not its head, and therefore could not judge in matters of religion. 2. That the heretics were wrong about what is understood by the name of the Church, and 3. That Christ is truly present in the Blessed Sacrament, about which no compromise could be made without the sacrifice of Christianity itself. Even the Prince of Conde told Cardinal d'Armagnac he was highly satisfied with Guise's discourse. Jacob Lesnes, General of the Society of Jesus, also refuted Beza, and Peter Martyr, and the Catholics rejoiced. In the court of Philip II, the news was not well received. Even if the heretics had been confounded, reasoned the king, they had advertised their cause and had increased their prestige by appearing in the royal presence. This pessimistic view was confirmed by events. Immediately, all over France, the Calvinist propaganda machine spread the rumour that Beza had won a victory at Poissy, and that the government had yielded to his demand for freedom of worship. The Huguenots, well supplied with money, took arms under Conde and Coligny, and began marching through the country to mobilization points, often under the leadership of preachers armed to the teeth. While these men thundered against the Scarlet Woman of Babylon and preached slaughter with a fervour more becoming of Mohammedans than to men who called themselves Christians, Philip II and the Pope were doing all in their power to have the council assembled at Trent, to bring about the real reform of abuses for which the heretics were clamouring. The first delegates had been waiting impatiently there since April, but so far no French, English, or Scotch bishops had been allowed to come. The whole force of Protestant influence at Paris and London was against the council. As Suriano wrote the Doge on August 15th, while the bishops, under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, are engaged in reforming their own defects and those of others, the heretics, moved by a very different spirit, are exciting evil passions in all parts of the kingdom. In Gascony and Languedoc, even before the meeting at Poissy, they had begun to sack bishops' houses and churches, to destroy altars and images of Christ and of the saints, and to deprive Catholics of their alms. During the weeks following the colloquy, the storm of hate which had so long been gathering burst in all its fury. Almost simultaneously, as if by a concerted signal, well-organised bands of Calvinists fell upon the Catholic churches, convents, schools, and libraries. At Montpellier, they sacked all the 60 churches and convents and put 150 priests and monks to the sword. At Nimes, they made a great pile of statues and relics in front of the cathedral, danced around it while the flames arose, yelled that they would have no more mass or idolaters, and then wrecked and plundered the churches. At Montauban, they dragged the poor Clares from their convent, exposed them half naked to the gibes of the paid mob, shouted insults at them, and told them to get married. At Castres, in December, a reformed consistory of Sanhedrin ordered the city officials to take every one found on the streets to Huguenot sermons. Priests were dragged from the altars, the poor Clares were scourged at the whip's end, peasants were driven with blows to hear the preachers inveigh with their peculiar nasal intonation against the Mass, confession, the Pope. The fields and vineyards around Catholic villages, where the people refused to listen to the preaching, were burned or cut down. Within a year, the Calvinists, according to one of their own estimates, murdered 4,000 priests, monks, and nuns, expelled or maltreated 12,000 nuns, sacked 20,000 churches, and destroyed 2,000 monasteries with their priceless libraries and works of art. The rare manuscript collection of the ancient monastery at Cluny was irreparably lost, with many others. Sacred vessels from the churches were melted into money to pay German mercenaries who were urged to be ruthless. Coligny took an active part in many of the atrocities. He displayed such cold and vindictive cruelty, especially to priests and nuns, that Catholics came to call him Holofernes. In some places, the entrails of the victims were plucked forth, stuffed with straw, and given to the horses of the Huguenot troopers to eat. Hundreds of cities and villages were burned. Lyon and its prosperous commerce were ruined. This ancient fury, deliberately cultivated, spared not even the dead. Not only was the tomb of William the Conqueror destroyed, but the venerated bodies of holy men and women who had spent their lives in the service of God and of the poor were dragged from their resting places, trampled, burned, thrown into rivers. A mob cast down the statue of Saint Joan from the bridge at Orleans. Other fanatics threw the remains of Saint Irenaeus and Saint Martin of Tours into the Loire. In Poitiers, they destroyed the relics of Saint Hilary and precious books written by his hand. Breaking into the tomb of St. Francis of Paula at Plessis-les-Tours, they found the body whole and incorrupt after more than half a century. Instead of being awed by the phenomenon, they dragged it at the end of a rope through the streets and burned it. A few of the saints' bones were found afterwards by Catholics and preserved in various churches of the order of Minimes. Not only those who had laid down their lives for Christ, but Christ himself seemed a special object of hatred to these men who called themselves Christians, and taught the damnation of infants and the predestination of many souls to hell. As in all anti-Christian revolutions, statues of the Saviour were spat upon, knocked down, and demolished. The body of Christ was often injured and reviled in the Blessed Sacrament. At Nimes, in Paris, and other places, the tabernacles were broken open, and the host thrown out and trampled upon, both by men and by horses. Although these atrocities were perpetrated by a small minority in an overwhelmingly Catholic country, all the forces of the national and local governments seemed paralysed and impotent for the moment. The Huguenots had a majority in the States General and friends in the Parliament of Paris. There seemed to be men everywhere in important positions to protect them and to sidetrack any attempt to punish them. Catherine, inspired by l'Hôpital, issued an edict in January 1562 giving the Calvinists the right to worship as they pleased outside the cities, provided the churches were restored and both sides abstained from violence. This was intended to mollify the Huguenots. It had no such effect. Taking it for the surrender it was, the Huguenots rejoiced over the first breach of the union of church and state in France. They promptly destroyed the cathedral in Béziers city and drove away all the clergy. In part of Gascony, no priest could be found within 40 miles. More nuns were dragged from convents, more tabernacles opened and profaned. In February, just after the opening session of the Council of Trent, with French delegates present thanks to the determination of their leader, the Cardinal of Lorraine, 70 Calvinist preachers met in a solemn synod at Nimes and deliberately planned to destroy all the Catholic churches in the city and the diocese. They promptly proceeded to put the plan into execution, burned the cathedral, and drove away all the priests. The reign of terror was not the impassioned, unthinking work of an ignorant mob, but a carefully engineered program of spoliation, destruction, and assassination. Most Catholics who had supported the Coligny faction for some political reason, such as a feud with the Guises, now withdrew. The Constable, Anne de Montmorency, left the politiques for the Catholic party. Anthony of Navarre returned to the faith, joined Duke Francis, and proposed establishing the Inquisition to heal the wounds of France. But it was too late for such a peaceful measure. In March we find Thomas Gresham, well informed by his spies, writing Cecil from Antwerp that "Here is advertisements come that the Prince of Conde hath the governance of the realm, and that Monseigneur Chatillon is great master of France, and that Monsieur Dendelot is Capitaine General of all the horsemen in France. The Cardinal of Lorraine and others of the Parliament of Paris have fled. Conde is expected to be victorious in the Low Countries, and Gresham joyfully hopes he will." Guise now started for Paris, at the invitation of Anthony of Navarre, taking along with an armed escort his children, and in a litter his sick wife, lovely daughter of René of France, and Duke Hercule d'Este of Ferrara, of whom Ronsard had sung "Venus les saintes en ses grâces habite." At Vassy, the cavalcade came upon a party of 600 or 700 Calvinists, most of them armed, holding a meeting in a barn. An altercation arose between some of Guise's men and the Huguenots. As the Duke rushed in to quell the disturbance, a Calvinist wounded him. Some of his men, infuriated, fell upon the heretics, killed 12 on the spot, and wounded 40 others, so badly that they afterwards died. Béziers and the other vociferous propagandists of Calvinism seized upon this unfortunate, but perhaps inevitable incident, inevitable considering the provocation given by the Calvinist reign of terror, to cry up the massacre of Vassy, until it was magnified into a cold-blooded slaughter of hundreds of noble and defenceless Huguenots. What is more remarkable is that so many modern historians have dated the Huguenot wars from this incident, instead of from the tumult of Amboise. Béziers preached a crusade against the Catholics. Conde made another attempt to seize the young king, but failed. Guise, meanwhile, marched into Paris, and was received with delirious joy by the citizens. The merchants offered him 2 million livres to defend the faith and to restore peace in the city. The Duke refused, saying he had come to place himself at the disposal of his king. Of all the principals in the first of the 8 bloody Huguenot wars, this man clearly stands out, calm, courageous, loyal, patriotic, and devout, a heroic character, one of the finest, surely, in French history. Catherine de Medici, now thoroughly frightened, made frantic appeals to Philip II and the Pope. While Conde assembled several thousand Huguenots and took Orleans by surprise, the King of Spain hastily sent to France 3,000 Spaniards, 4,000 Italians, and some Flemish cavalry, and a sum of money besides. He wrote his cousin, King Maximilian of Hungary, begging him to come to the rescue of Christendom, but received a very lukewarm response. Pope Pius IV agreed to help Catherine on condition that she dismissed l'Hôpital. On her doing so, he forwarded 25,000 scudi, which he borrowed at 10%. A letter of L'Hôpital to the Pope, protesting that he was a good Catholic, does not seem to have changed the Holy Father's opinion of his policies. The Châtillon already had a pretty satisfactory understanding with that other royal woman, Elizabeth, and her man of business, Cecil. Cardinal Châtillon conducted the preliminary negotiations, and his brother, Admiral Coligny, sent agents to sign the infamous Treaty of Hampton Court, September 20th, 1562, whereby he betrayed his country for the advantage of the Huguenot sect. In exchange for 100,000 gold crowns to be paid by Elizabeth at Frankfurt or Strasbourg, and for military aid, he agreed to give Calais back to England. As security, he handed over the port of Havre de Grace, which the English promptly garrisoned. The French Protestants were just as international-minded as the English Protestants had been when the latter betrayed Calais into the hands of the traditional enemy of their country. In each case, the Protestant was ready to sacrifice his country on the altar of an international sect, or more accurately, of an international hatred of the Catholic Church and Catholics, but that was all that the various factions of dissenters had in common. It comes almost as a shock to one accustomed to reading the usual cant about the patriotism of Protestants and the subservience of Catholics to the political interests of Rome and the nonsense attributing the Reformation to nationalism, to find that in general Catholics were only too pathetically eager to put patriotism before their duty to the Church, whereas Protestants from the beginning were united in an international political union that seldom balked at any betrayal of national interests short of giving up nationalistic authority over their fellow citizens. Yet it is Coligny who becomes the hero of popular history and biography, and the Guises, who are always mentioned with a sort of hiss. At all events, the English had Havre, and were now actively in the French war. 4,000 of them joined Conde's rebels at Orléans before the end of 1562. Others garrisoned Rouen and Dieppe. For a long time to come, the Huguenot towns were to be more loyal to Elizabeth than to their own government. Conde appealed to the German Protestants, who began sending him troops. Duke Francis of Guise, with 3,000 cavalry, 3,000 crack Spanish infantry, 12,000 French infantry, and 6,000 Swiss, marched to besiege Conde and Coligny at Orléans. On December 19th, the Catholic army crossed the river, as St. John had once crossed it. Guise was in the vanguard with the Spaniards and Gascons. The French infantry and cavalry were behind them. The enemy were waiting for them, in battle formation near Dreux. The Catholic artillery fire was ineffectual, and the Huguenots, in spite of their lack of cavalry, attacked so furiously that they routed the Swiss and the cavalry of the Constable Montmorency. Victory seemed in their grasp. They were already singing songs of triumph when the Spanish infantry launched a counterattack with such good effect that the tide was turned, and the day won, though not without heavy losses, including, among the dead, the Marshal of Saint-André. The aid of Philip II had been decisive. On hearing of this victory, Pope Pius IV had a solemn mass of thanksgiving sung at San Spirito on January 3, 1563, and wrote the French Catholics, urging them to follow up their success. Duke Francis proceeded to do this by laying siege to Orléans. He would undoubtedly have taken this chief stronghold of the Huguenots and ended the war, if he had not been treacherously shot with a poisoned bullet from the arquebuse of one Pultrot de Mer, a Calvinist in the employ of the Lord of Subiez, who had taken service in the Catholic army for that purpose. A wail of grief went up from Paris and other Catholic cities. The Huguenot leaders and preachers loudly applauded the crime. Pultrot was captured and taken before his victim. The Duke forgave him, and said he prayed God to forgive him too. The murderer confessed that he had been hired by Admiral Coligny, Theodore Beza, and Soubise to do the deed, and had been paid 100 crowns for it. He quoted the fanatic Beza as saying that the Queen, the King, his brothers, all the Guises, and the papal legates must be put to death. Guise died several days later, February 27, 1562, like a good Christian, an excellent prince, and a great captain, wrote Barbaro to the Venetians, having received all the sacraments, confident of the mercy of God, and welcoming death. This vile crime undid all the work of Guise and his friends, and left the Catholic party without a leader. The Duke's brother, Cardinal Lorraine, was able, courageous, of irreproachable life, but he was at the Council of Trent. Montmorency was a prisoner. Anthony of Navarre and the Marshal of Saint-André were dead. L'Hôpital, the man of compromises, hied him back from exile to the side of Catherine de Medici. The frightened queen made another humiliating surrender to the Huguenots, giving them, in the Treaty of Amboise, March 1563, an amnesty and freedom of worship. Philip II strenuously protested against the treaty, on the ground that a kingdom with two religions has in it two monarchies with two heads. Catherine preferred to listen to L'Hôpital, and she mentioned the invasion of German Protestants and the English occupation of French towns as excuses for virtually handing over the government to the party who had sold the country to the English. By the wiles of a court lady, Conde was won over to the side of the politiques. Cardinal Chatillon returned to court with his brother, the Admiral. Michel L'Hôpital, back in favour, was seen at Mass every morning. The constable, who had a habit of saying the rosary beads while talking or giving orders to his troops or his horse, was released. There was a lull in the storm, and everything was agreeable on the surface, but the Catholics went about repeating a litany. From the Admiral's toothpick, the constable's beads, the Chancellor's Mass, Chatillon's red hat, Libere nos Domine. For they have undone us, and they will undo us. Cecil's agent Throckmorton was carefully watching Cardinal Chatillon and reporting all his movements to London, for it was feared he might become reconciled to Rome. Philip II was in a difficult position. He had lost a fleet in 1560. His 70 vessels were wrecked by a storm in 1561 before they were paid for. Before he could assemble a third fleet, Moorish pirates were raiding Andalusia and Gibraltar and causing damage amounting to more than 200,000 ducats. In 1562, he could get together only 32 galleys. 25 of these were destroyed by a tempest on their way to Oran, with the loss of all the stores, 80,000 ducats in money, and the lives of 10,000 of the best fighting men of Spain. 23 ships burned at Seville, 12 others were shattered by a tempest in Cadiz harbour. Sicily and Naples were almost defenceless. King Philip had only 20 galleys left with which to protect his vast coastline. The heroic defence of Mer el Kabir by 200 Spaniards for 2 months against 20,000 Turks was a glorious chapter in Spanish history, 1563. It did not alter the fact that the Mediterranean had become virtually a Mohammedan lake. The rise of the Huguenots to power made it all the more necessary to keep France and England separated. This is one reason, perhaps, why Philip continued to cultivate the friendship of Queen Elizabeth, even after her position was clear. It took him a long time to discover how closely interconnected were the Protestant movements in France and in England. Even then he continued to underestimate Cecil in the face of what should have been abundant evidence. "Cecil rules the Queen," wrote Ferrier, and "Cecil is a pestilent knave, as your Majesty well knows." But Philip could not cease to regard his sister Elizabeth as an absolute sovereign, who could get rid of a pestilent knave if she chose. To this illusion, Cecil deliberately contributed by emphasizing the trappings of royalty and by the deference he paid to his most dread sovereign on state occasions. He was completely lacking in that silly personal vanity that made ministers like Wolsey wish to glitter in public. Like L'Hôpital, he was content to let the sovereign have the shadow, so long as he held the substance. Even her emotional appetency for the symbols and ceremonies of the Catholic faith, her sharing of her father's desire for such a contradiction in terms as a Catholic Church cut off from Rome, was useful to him. It kept moderate Catholics in hope that she would not go too far to turn back. It had some such effect upon Philip II. His support of the Queen further confused the English, and kept them from rising up against Cecil when they might have done so successfully. So Elizabeth continued, every Maundy Thursday, to wash the feet of beggars, as her sister had done. It was symbolic of that shrivelling of the Catholic spirit under the outer husk of the new political Church of England that she disdained to touch the feet of the poor wretches until they had first been scrubbed with hot water and soap and well sprinkled with sweet-smelling herbs by a yeoman of the laundry. Philip II continued to abase himself before the common human clay, as Christ had done. So long as Spain had kings, there would be such reminders of the unchanging truth of Christianity. The kings of England would end by not washing the feet at all, doling out a few coins instead. It was only an imaginary Christianity, a travesty that Elizabeth clung to, half despisingly. Cecil had spun the net of illusion about her until he was her master, principally by playing upon her fears. He had agents work up pretended plots against her life to frighten her and keep her dependent on his vigilance. He managed her completely, changed her letters, countermanded her orders behind her back, withheld important facts from her. Enemy of Mary Stuart 20 years before he accomplished her death, he was already beginning, by small cautious strokes, to break down Elizabeth's repugnance to the shedding of the blood of a relative and a royal person. Presently we shall find him writing in code to Norris, his ambassador in France, that Elizabeth mislikes the Prince of Conde, but the Lords of the Council do all they can to cover the same. He explains that Her Majesty, being a prince herself, is doubtful to give comfort to subjects, but Norris is to go ahead just the same and comfort Conde and his friends, as occasion serves. Belloc has given other examples, notably Cecil's getting the council in 1561 to reverse Elizabeth's decision to receive the Pope's legate. Belloc truly says, "He cut the bonds between England and the Universal Church in such a fashion that those who were most opposed to that revolution suffered it by degrees, being led they knew not whither." Cecil took good care to see that any lurking sentiments of natural gratitude in Elizabeth should not blossom into friendship for the King of Spain. As early as March 1559, plays written by scribblers in the pay of the English government were being presented in hostels and taverns of London, deriding Philip, his late wife Mary, and Cardinal Pole. Elizabeth was indignant, according to the Venetian ambassador, and forbade the performances. Cecil evidently disregarded her wishes. Fully 8 weeks later, the plays were still going on, and Ferrier protested to the Queen. She was very emphatic in saying she wished to punish severely certain persons who had represented some comedies in which your Majesty was taken off. I passed it by and said that these were matters of less importance than the others, the religious changes, although, both in jest and in earnest, more respect ought to be paid to so great a prince as your Majesty, and I knew that a member of her council had given the arguments to construct the comedies, which is true, for Cecil gave them, as indeed she partly admitted to me. Master Secretary had gradually begun to suppress all freedom of speech. Publications had to pass his censors to be licensed. Every intimation of dissent, political or religious, was put down with a sternness that would have seemed outrageously narrow to a Spanish inquisitor. At the same time, a positive campaign of glorification of Elizabeth was undertaken. Ballads written in her praise by pensioners were hawked in the streets. In 1559 there appeared that song between the Queen's Majesty and England, of which Shakespeare would quote the first line in King Lear. Come over the bourne, Bessie, come over the bourne, Bessie. Sweet Bessie, come over to me, and I shall thee take, and my dear lady make, before all other that ever I see. Very early in his regime, Cecil had a network of spies serving him all over Europe under various ambassadors. His man Throckmorton went to Paris to encourage the Huguenots and the Dutch Calvinists. In 4 more years we shall find Sir Thomas Sackville, relative of the Queen through the Boleyns, in Rome as Cecil's agent. The Pope has him arrested and thrown into prison on suspicion of being a spy, but cannot get evidence enough to prove the case, and releases him, apparently with a gift, to assuage his injured feelings. Cecil makes inquiries about it through Benedict Spinola, generally called a Florentine banker in London, but actually a Jew, whom Cecil had got into his power by catching him in a violation of the smuggling laws. Spinola writes his friend Guaroni Bertano in Rome. The latter replies that Sackville has been released and received in kindly fashion by Pope Pius IV, and has had, or will have, 500 crowns. I have done more in the matter than he knows. Sackville then proceeded to Flanders, and later represented Cecil in the court of the Emperor, still later in the court of France. Spinola, meanwhile, according to a report of Philip's ambassador, had turned Protestant, and was very violent about it. While Throckmorton departed for Paris and Sackville for Rome, Francis Russell, Earl of Bedford, was sojourning, as we have seen, in Ferrara and other centres of anti-Catholic intrigue. He was the son of that Earl of Bedford who, with Gresham, had met Philip at Santiago in 1554. Sir Thomas Gresham had been called from his sublimated pawnshop, as it virtually was, at the sign of the Grasshopper in Lombard Street, to serve the Queen's Majesty in the Netherlands. King Philip had hardly turned his back on his northern dominions when this affable man of business, the agent of a friendly power, began intriguing against him. In October, about the time when Philip was attending his first auto da fe in Valladolid, Gresham was bribing Jasper Schetz, Philip's factor in Antwerp, to betray his employer. Schetz, who wrote poetry and collected coins in the hours of leisure provided by his usuries, had been the trusted chief factor of Philip's father. He and his two brothers, Melchior and Balthazar, were in prosperous partnership. In 1556, they had had a coin struck containing their armorial bearings, appropriate enough, a crow with wings displayed. He was not only Philip's factor, but a member of the Council of Finance for the Netherlands, and already stood high in the favour of the regent, Margaret of Parma. As Gresham wrote to Cecil, he ruled the whole finance and bourse of Antwerp, and favoured the Queen's religion. Gresham lived at his house. Gresham promised this fixer, or thimble rigger, as he would now be called in American politics, the sum of 600 crowns, in return for which Schetz promised that the regent would issue a decree by October 20th, 1559, that no man should take above 1% for the difference of current money and permission money. The decree was issued, and Queen Elizabeth, who was prepared for what was coming, saved at least £2,000 on exchange. Gresham asked Cecil to forward 500 crowns to pay Schetz, and Elizabeth sent him a chain worth that sum. An important part of Gresham's mission in the Low Countries was to obtain a supply of arms and munitions, to enable Cecil to build up an army, to use, if need be, against the English Catholic majority and the legitimate Scotch government. Philip's laws, like those of his father, strictly forbade the exportation of such merchandise. But Gresham well understood the art of smuggling and began shipping ammunition to England. Margaret's suspicions being aroused, she had all ships searched in May 1560. Gresham was secretly warned of this. On June 29th he wrote triumphantly to his friend Cecil, "I have corrupted the chief searcher, whom is all my doer, and hath right honestly desired a worthy reward. So, by him and through his advice, I am doing daily. If it is discovered, there is nothing short of death with the searcher, and with him who enters it at the custom house." In one ship alone he sent munitions worth £9,000 sterling. A rumour of what was going on got back from London to Antwerp, but the chief searcher told Gresham about it. Gresham wrote Cecil that no one on the receiving end must know about the business except a Mr. Blumfeld, evidently an officer in the Ordnance Department in the Tower of London, whom's yes a very honest secret gentleman, and circumspect in all his doings. In sending news of shipments about to leave, Gresham pretended to be purchasing cloth for the Queen's wardrobe. Thus he would write that the ships containing Her Majesty's velvets and crimson satins were held by the wind, but should sail soon. Velvet standing for gunpowder, silks, damasks, and satins for various arms and munitions. In the role of financier, as a grovelling tradition has euphemistically called this money changer, Gresham had talents of no mean order. From the standpoint of his employers, he seemed to do little less than make 2 blades of grass grow where only one had grown before. In the view of some of the unsuspecting Christians, merchants, and others, among whom he carried on his deft operations from time to time, he was more like a Howmutton wind from Africa, or the sirocco that passes over a fair land and leaves everything parched, withered, and suckered dry in the wake of its desolation. To their eyes, the grasshopper over the door of his shop on Lombard Street was only too reminiscent of those hordes of locusts that passed like a shuddering blight over the crops of the Egyptians. Wherever he passed, there was likely to be a financial panic and business depression, as when he visited Spain in 1554. Elizabeth, like most sovereigns, was pinched for money. One of Gresham's duties was to raise money. Apparently he suggested that she might pay her debts by juggling the London-Antwerp exchange and creating a panic. It may be inferred that Elizabeth, who despised meanness in others, though she herself grew increasingly stingy with time, scorned the advice. There is extant among the Hatfield papers a memorandum by Gresham addressed to her, earnestly defending his plan. He pointed out that England had been having monetary difficulties ever since her father debased the coinage by half, causing exchange to fall from 26 shillings 8 to 13 shillings 4, and all fine gold to be taken out of England. When Henry's wars put him in debt in Flanders, he had to pay by exchange and carry his fine gold over. In 1551, Edward VI, being deeply in debt, had asked the aid of Gresham, probably through Secretary Cecil. Exchange was then at 15 shillings and 16 shillings the pound, and your money current as now not in value 10 shillings. First Gresham had to overthrow the Still-yard, as he expressed it, with the aid of the King and old Northumberland. He arranged to have the English mere merchants pay Edward 15 shillings on a cloth at Antwerp, to pay at double usance 20 shillings in London. This the King paid. It amounted to £60,000 sterling. 6 months later, the same transaction was made with £70,000 at the rate of 22 shillings per pound sterling. So by these means I made plenty off money and scarcity, and brought into the King's hands, which raised the exchange to 23 shillings 4, and by these means I did not only bring the King Majesty, your brother, out of debt, whereby I saved him 6 or 7 shillings upon the pound, but saved his treasure within the realm, as there in Mr. Secretary Cecil was most privy. Gresham next recalled that when Edward died, Bishop Gardiner, who was an honest man, sought to undo him and discredit him. But Mary was in such desperate financial straits that when Gresham made a timely offer of his services, they were accepted. And I bought the Queen Majesty, your sister, out of debt of the sum of £435,000 sterling. He proposed doing likewise for Elizabeth. With exchange high, the merchants will seek to bring gold and silver into England. So consequently, the higher the exchange riseth, the more shall your Majesty and your realm and commonweal flourish, which thing is only kept up by art and God's providence, for the Queen of this realm doth not correspond in fines not 10 shilling the pound. He was a little more frank in writing to his friend Cecil, who for the time being affected reluctance, but allowed himself to be won over with the Queen. With the like practice twice done in King Edward's time, I did raise the exchange from 16 shillings to 23 shillings 3, whereby all foreign commodities and ours grew good cheap, and thereby we robbed all Christendom of their fine gold and fine silver, and by raising of the exchange and so keeping of it up, the fine gold and fine silver remains for ever within our realm. Sir, if you will enter upon this matter, you may in no wise relent by no persuasion of the merchants, whereby you may keep them in fear and in good order, for otherwise if they get the bridle, you shall never rule them. The results, he added, would be 1. The raising of exchange and enriching of the Queen and the realm. 2. The paying of the Queen's debts. 3. Advancing the Queen's homeward credit, in such sort as shall astonish King Philip and the French King. Permission was given. Gresham went to work. In February 1560, he wrote Cecil that the exchange would rise to 23 shillings and upwards, and Elizabeth would gain. She was to pay £60,000 by exchange and redeliver in London. Prices would then fall. When she paid her debts, interest would not be over 5%. There was already great scarcity of money on the bourse. The rumour had gone abroad among the other merchants that he was betraying them and likely to rob them of all their fine gold and silver. The Italians and Spaniards were so angry
that his life was in danger. In the panic that ensued by this deliberate planning, prices fell almost half. Many merchants were ruined, as in 1551, especially in the cloth trades. Gresham had accomplished his purpose. He began shipping gold bullion very secretly to London, in violation of the laws of Flanders. On March 8th he wrote jubilantly to Cecil that not a penny was to be had on that bourse except through his hands. It is easy to understand why Gresham was not popular among the businessmen of Flanders. As for the general population, who suffered from unemployment and want as the result of his swindle, they hardly knew, perhaps, of his existence. In 1558, Gresham had formulated the law, since known to students of economics as Gresham's Law, that bad money drives out good. Even that glory he stole from Copernicus and Erasmus. On returning to England from the Low Countries, he offered to build a Royal Exchange in London if the city would furnish the land. The offer was accepted. Gresham put up the first exchange building, parts of which he then proceeded to rent at a handsome profit. In addition to his financial operations, this worthy conducted a rather elaborate intelligence system, whose ramifications extended even to Spain and Rome, sifting out information for Cecil. His spies sent him news of the Pope, the Grand Turk, and Philip II. From Toledo he had regular information from his servant, John Gerbridge. His man Clough travelled to Germany. He wrote Cecil in April 1560 that King Philip was preparing to aid the French king to subdue the Scots. It was feared in Antwerp that the regent would presently make some sudden arrests, presumably in Orange's faction. His tone of hostility to Philip, who had done him nothing but kindness, was evident from the first. In May 1560 he wrote Cecil triumphantly, "According as I have written you, I cannot see which way King Philip can annoy her Highness this year, considering he hath neither money, ships, nor men, nor munition, nor armour. Nevertheless it is good to doubt the worst, and to trust to no words, and for my part I have given abroad that the Queen's Majesty hath 200 ships in readiness, well armed." It is difficult to see why Gresham should have harped on the danger to be feared from Philip's wickedness, when the latter was so unprepared for war, but no doubt such reports were of good use to Cecil in keeping the Queen afraid. When the news reached Antwerp that Philip's great fleet had been destroyed at Gelbs by the Mohammedan foes of Christendom, Gresham fairly gloated. "Sir," he wrote Cecil in June 1560, "this loss is more greater than here they will be known of, and as little lamented among his subjects here, what for his religion and government. And now they say here that King Philip hath more need at this present to seek for help than to help the French king, because the Turks is so strong upon him, and the most part of his galleys and ships be taken and lost. Therefore, Sir the Queen's Majesty needeth not to doubt nothing of King Philip's proceedings for this year." Philip's 4,000 Spanish troops were still in their garrisons and could not be moved. Philip could not pay them, and the States would give him no money for the purpose, though the Orange faction was loud enough in its complaints of their presence. Finally, Margaret of Parma sent them to Zeeland, where Gresham's spies observed them and reported frequently until they sailed for Spain. Gresham feared they might go to Scotland to aid Mary Stuart's cause. He predicted that, if Philip II should fight Elizabeth, all the Protestant noblemen of the Netherlands would rise against him. 2 days later he reported William of Orange attempting to raise large sums. Yet he demonstrated in almost every letter how powerless Philip really was against the English. As time goes on, we shall find Gresham establishing close relations with the Prince of Orange, and keeping Cecil well informed about his opinions and movements, while William the Silent strengthens his party in preparation for the revolt he intends to make when the time is ripe, as his grumbling clearly shows on one occasion when he gets drunk while dining with the English financier. It was now thoroughly understood in Spain, and had been suspected by thoughtful and informed Catholics everywhere, especially since the Tumult of Amboise in March 1560, that the various enemies of the Catholic Church and the Catholic culture, whatever their differences of creed, dogma, race, nationality, were united in action by some extraordinary principle of cohesion and cooperation. It was almost as if there existed, in opposition to the Christian hierarchical organization that had its world centre in Rome, and an actual organization throughout the world, at any rate throughout Europe, of an invisible kingdom of opposition. It had all the characteristics of some of those widespread secret societies of the Middle Ages, but on a larger scale. Its secrecy was a source of tremendous strength. The Catholic forces, confused and divided, worked in the open, where they could be seen and attacked. The opposition could plan and strike unseen. It could carry on propaganda among masses, innocent of its very existence. It was fraudulent, for it did not scruple to support contradictory religious sects and factions, both of which could not be true. It always followed the principle, which it falsely attributed to the Jesuits, that the end justifies the means. It employed and fostered corruption. It aped and travestied the Catholic Church in the name of freedom. It was very skillful in imputing to the Church all its own vices. The one principle of union in this hydra-headed body was an ancient and implacable hatred, a hatred of something it pronounced dead, but feared as one fears only things that are terribly vital. It was the odium Christi, directed against his Church. In every age the Church would say with Christ, "Did not Moses give you the law, and yet none of you keepeth the law? Why seek you to kill me?" And the opposition would echo the hypocritical answer, "Thou hast a devil, who seeketh to kill thee," and to continue quietly towards its purpose of death. This opposition developed in the course of centuries all the characteristics that Christians, from apostolic times, had expected to find in the kingdom of the Antichrist, even to the sending out of false Christs and false prophets to call the vicar of Christ the Antichrist. A similar spirit in the modern world has been detected by the Catholic Church, identified after long and careful study with the various secret societies operating under the name of Freemasonry, and its allied fraternal organizations, and solemnly and officially denounced as the real source of communism, atheism, and the general corruption and confusion of our times, by no less than 9 popes, and their decrees condemning even the so-called harmless forms of masonry are maintained in full force by Pope Pius XI. These decrees go back only to the first part of the 18th century. The thing then discovered was too widespread, too well entrenched, too complete in organization and purpose, to have come into existence overnight. Is it not time for historians to examine critically the boasting claims of Freemasons that their society goes back to the Middle Ages, if not further, and to ask, in the present connection, whether or not it formed a link of mysterious cooperation between enemies of the Catholic Church, who raised such formidable obstacles all over the world, to King Philip II?